class. Welcome to our discussion about population. This is a very important topic when we're dealing with the environment because we think about the impact of humans on the environment and we have to therefore talk about the quantity of humans. One of the most important things that we need to consider is the growth of population relative to resources. And when we talk about that, we reflect back on the work of Thomas Malthus. Now, Thomas Malthus was a minister and an economist and a popular figure of his day. And at his time, in the 1700s, he came up with this idea by looking at the Industrial Revolution and the expanding numbers of people. He looked at that and he saw that the population was growing exponentially while the food sources were linear in terms of the amount of land that they had. And by evaluating these two of the graph, he was able to show that it would appear, anyway, that the people at that time were headed for a disaster. That disaster was going to be mass starvation. And he knew that this had happened in the past, and so he was a voice of warning. Now, he was very popular, as I said, because the press picked up on this, and he was brought in to speak in different places, and he had a big influence on politicians. However, we know that that didn't happen. So the question is why? What changed? Why was the world able to grow exponentially in terms of population, which it did, and yet not run out of food? And the answer to that question is because for the first time in the world, there was a market economy. Now, the market economy is driven by price. And so what happens, and this is very important, what happens is that as the population grows and the food source becomes more scarce, naturally the price goes up. As the price goes up, entrepreneurs see an opportunity to make more money. And so they enter the market. That means more farmers, more people to grow crops. When they can't get more land, they look at how can I get more food from the land I have? And so through innovation, they came up with better fertilizers. They came up with insecticides. They came up with different versions of the grains, either through genetic crossbreeding or through genetic alterations. And the result is that the food sources ended up growing as faster than the population. And so today, we have a world with 7.5 billion people and enough food that we're actually paying farmers not to grow food. Now, this is a very similar thing that happened in the 1970s with oil. What happened was that the government had put a maximum price on oil of 29 cents a gallon. And as you can imagine, there was a shortage of oil. In fact, I remember in high school in the 70s that we were told that there would be no more oil available anywhere in the world because we were using it up too fast, and that by 1984, there would be no oil at all, and cars would have to be abandoned, and we would basically have to walk or bicycle everywhere. Now, again, that didn't happen. Why not? Well, because what happened was Ronald Reagan, when he became president, took the price controls off of the oil, and once the price went from 29 cents to $1.29, then all of a sudden entrepreneurs were out looking for oil. They were drilling deeper, they were looking in other places because there was an opportunity to make a lot of money. And the result is that today, without price controls, we now have, just in the continental and Alaskan United States, we have a 400-year supply of oil that we know about in the ground. The difference being that there was an opportunity to make money. Ironically, the gasoline today, at less than $1 a gallon, is cheaper in real dollars than it was in the 1970s. It has occurred in the past, but since we've become a market economy, it seems to have gone away. And the market economy is able to adapt to it. And that's an important thing to remember. I'll have questions about this on the exam. So let's talk more about population. So what is happening with the population? Well, another thing that happened in the 70s was, or late 60s, was there was a book that came out. It was a bestseller called The Population Bomb. And it told us that, again, like Malthus, that the world was going to have too many people and this was going to be a huge problem. Well, believe it or not, the opposite may be true. And in fact, probably will be true, because the current prediction for population is that we will continue to grow until about 2050, and then we will see a turn and population will start decreasing in the world. Now, why is this going to happen? It seems to everybody that the population will continue to grow. Well, the fact is that the seeds for this have already been sown. In order to have a growing population in the long run, we have to produce 2.1 children for every woman. Now you might say, why 2.1, Dr. Thomas? Well, it's because there are more boys born than girls, and so to balance it out, we have to have 2.1. Now, if we don't have at least 2.1, then we won't produce enough children to replace us, and therefore eventually we will see a decline in the population. Notice I said eventually. That's because it depends on life expectancy. You see, the reason why population is still going up is not because we're having more children than the 2.1, because we're having less than 2.1 right now. It's because we keep increasing our life expectancy, particularly in third world countries. As we do, the people there hang around longer. And I have some graphs that will illustrate this. This graph is known as a population pyramid, and it is used to be able to look at the balance between male and female at the various ages in the population. And what we've done here is, using UN data, is we've overlaid a series of these population pyramids over a period of time, so you can see what things looked like several decades ago, what they look like now, what they look like in the future. And as you can see, the baseline hasn't changed much in the last little while, but instead the pyramid has become fatter on the top. That's because we have more people surviving to a greater age. And as you can see, if you add up all the numbers, you have more people and the population is growing, even though you're not having enough children to necessarily replace those that are already above them. Now in this table, I show you the birth rates from 1950 through 2010 for the world, for the developed nations, and for the less developed nations. And as you can see, in 1950, both the developed and less developed nations were growing. And then in the 1960s, we were just holding our own in the developed world. By that time, the pill had taken effect and had been around for a decade. 1970, it dropped to 1.8, 1.7, 1.5, 1.4, currently at 1.1 among all developed nations. The combined between the two is 2.0. So for the first time, the world is below the 2.1 necessarily. So the population will probably hit somewhere between 9 and 10 billion, and then it will turn and head back down again. And you might say, well, that's great. Well, it might be great, but it might be better to have a set number so it doesn't keep declining. It can need to go back down to 0. So why are we having fewer children? Well, there's a lot of reasons for it, but the single biggest factor, or at least determinant, from our research suggests that it has to do with the education of women. That the more women that are educated in a society, the fewer children that they have. And that's something you can think about. I might even ask a question about that on the exam. You can give me your thoughts. Some of you have gone to small high schools. I've had students that have gone to high schools with a student body of less than 100. And I know that some of the students have gone to high schools that are very large. I've had students with student bodies of 3,000 or 4,000 students. The question is, which school is going to have the better football team? Clearly, there's going to be better football teams, virtually every case except for maybe Hoosiers, if they have more students. And that's because they have more students to choose from in terms of talent. Well, the smaller schools have very few people to draw on. And this is what happens with countries. countries that have large populations are going to be more likely to come up with innovations. If you look at where most of the innovations come today, they're coming out of the United States, they're coming out of China, they're coming out of India, they're coming out of the countries with large populations. And those innovations are what make it possible for us to have a good life and to become more and more wealthy. So we don't want the population to go to zero, or we could have some real problems. Another problem with the declining population is the younger people who are working are providing support for the older people. What happens if you have a smaller and smaller number of younger people and a larger and larger group of older people? Well, that will be quite a drain on society, and it'll bankrupt social security systems and so forth. You have to think twice about whether or not you're going to have any social security dollars by the time you get to that point. So here's the population pyramid of Spain as an example of what I was just talking about. As you can see, in 2005, their population of young people between, say, 0 and 20 was far smaller than the population between 25 and 40. So it's not going to be too many years after that, probably about now, that the younger population will not be able to support the older population, and the country will have very serious problems, which it is. So the very last week coming up, we're going to be putting together all the things that we've talked about and focus on a discussion about sustainability. Now, sustainability is about how do we continue to operate as humans on this planet, consuming resources, and have those resources not be depleted. And of course, we know that some of the resources are replenishable as long as we don't overconsume them. So we don't have to worry about those so much, water and air. And we know that some of the resources are renewable as long as we don't end up eating all the chickens or all the fish or whatever, and that we don't leave enough to repopulate. But there are some things that we need to think about. We need to think about, for example, oil, power. We need to think about food if the population gets too large. And so this next week, we'll have a lecture about that and try to create a discussion board where we can give our thoughts. But along with those potential problems of a large population are also the advantages of a large population. And I mentioned innovation, but there are other advantages. There's diversity. There's the different skill sets that people bring, different jobs that people can do in the development of different, say, pharmaceuticals or music or the arts of different kinds. So the richness of life that we can gain from having a larger population, there's a reason why people like to move to the big cities, because they have more choices that they can select from. And so there's a lot of reasons why a larger population is good. Now, based on all the research that I've looked at from the UN and other sources, it looks like about 2050 we'll start to see a decrease in the population. And it's really hitting the European countries already. Spain and Italy have replacement rates of about 1 instead of 2.1. The US has a replacement rate right now of only 1.3, 1.4, and dropping. And you might say, but Dr. Thomas, our population is growing in the US. Yes, it is. Almost entirely from immigration, not from new babies being born to the people that are citizens. And then what we see happening is we're seeing in sub-Saharan Africa and other areas where they're still having large families, that in those areas we have introduced good medicine and clean water, so they're living longer, and that is increasing the world's population because the people are staying around longer, even though they're starting to have smaller families. Along with those things, we've also introduced education for the women, and the populations per family are starting to decline rapidly. So we expect that over the next couple of decades, or 2 or 3 decades, we will see a dramatic slowdown in the growth and then a decline as we start to drop. And if we don't do something, we're going to have fewer and fewer people. Some countries are going to empty out or be taken over by people who may move in to replace the people that are there because they're not replacing themselves. Humans are a renewable resource too. And if we don't renew ourselves as a resource, we won't be around to play our role in the environment. So what is the right size? What is the right number of people for this planet? Well, I don't know what that number is, but we can talk about it. But it's not going to be 0, and it's probably not going to be 500 billion. It's going to be some number. But at this point, even if we decided that we wanted to start having more children, it would be a little bit late because the seeds for the decline are already in the funnel.